So guys, just on behalf of myself, a big thank you there for joining us tonight, and obviously thank you to Kate as well for taking on the challenge. So we all know this is a very important topic in all sports, not just athletics. So hopefully Kate can shed some light on that there for us in a minute. But as usual, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to throw them into the group chat, and myself and Grace can get along to them there in a minute. So no, just big thanks from the Cork Sports Partnership, and sit back, enjoy, and I know I will myself. So over to you, Grace.
Yeah, thanks very much, Craig. Yeah, just on behalf of Athletics Ireland, I'm delighted to have Kate here this evening. I'm sure we're all going to learn loads from her. So again, if you have questions, make sure to put them into the chat box. I'm sure there'll be opportunities throughout the night as well to unmute yourselves as well and have a bit of a discussion. But for now, just sit back and take it all in, and hope you enjoy. Pass it over to you, Kate.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Thanks for that. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah, all good.
Fab. Okay, so first of all, thanks for the introduction, and also welcome everyone from myself as well. Thanks very much for being here this evening for this webinar. So my name is Dr. Kate Keeffe, and I will be presenting this webinar on sports psychology for athletes. So as you can probably tell, it's quite a broad topic, and there's so much that I could have spoken about today in terms of the different even sub-disciplines of sports psychology. So I thought that it might be probably most beneficial within the next 45 minutes or so for me to give you a bit of insight into what sports psychology is and how it can actually help with regards to performance for athletes. And also, I've decided as well to give you a couple of different tips and tricks that you can take away to hopefully help you improve your performance, and also if you're a coach that you can probably maybe take away and teach to your own athletes. So as well, just before we dive into it, I'd like this webinar to be a little bit interactive, so I might ask some questions every now and then. So it'd be great if you could give your insight into the chat, and we can just have a bit of a dialogue as we go as well, because sometimes I will be giving a lot of information all at once. So it'll be nice to break it up to see if you've used some of the strategies before and what your insights would be on them. So, okay, let's dive into it then. So, how can I do? Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to cover today. So I'll start off with a tiny bit about me and my background and how I got here. And then I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction into sports psychology, so what it is and why it's important, and also what it is not. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept known as mental load, which is one of the big topics of sports psychology and that I use with my athletes. Then we're going to go into how to start off right. So with any sporting endeavor or anything that we decide to do in any sport, we always want to start off right and on the right foot. So I'm going to help you teach you some strategies to do that. Then we're going to go into something known as pre-performance routines, which some of you might know. So there are different strategies that we can use before performance to help with maintaining performance. Then I'm going to go through strategies that we can do during performance. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some strategies that we often use or teach to our athletes for post-performance. So just a little bit about me. So I started off with an undergraduate in the University of Limerick, and I did that in physical education and maths. And then I moved on to do a master's degree in sport and exercise psychology in the University of Jyväskylä, which is in Finland. And then after that, and most recently, I finished a PhD specializing in performance in extreme environments. So that was in Loughborough in the UK, and it was all about how to improve performance or maintain performance in high altitude, heat stress, and cold stress. Then I am now back in Dublin. I'm doing a postdoc in UCD. So I'm a researcher in sports science department. I'm also head of performance psychology with G Science, who are a health and performance company focused on e-sport athletes. And lastly, I'm founder of Oren Performance, which is a performance psychology company focusing on how to help people and athletes perform in high stress and extreme environments. So that's enough about me. So now let's dive into what sports psychology is all about. So what is sports psychology and what is it? not. So first of all, I just wanted to ask the attendees today, if just a simple yes or no, how many people here have actually used sports psychology services before, or have you seen a sports psych? Okay, got a couple of yeses, that's good. Okay, so more than I expected, to be honest. There's more yeses in there than no, so that's great. Okay, so we'll be touching on some topics that you might have covered before later on. So let's talk then what sports psychology is. So sports psychology is one of the many different areas of performance that can help you achieve consistent and optimal performance. And this sports psychology often comes alongside the other pillars, which include, for example, nutrition, strength and conditioning, lifestyle support, etc. So we often do this as sports psychologists. We help our athletes basically improve performance through what we call mental skills training, which often helps both inside and outside of performance. And mental skills training involves consistently practicing like you would the physical side of your sport, and specifically working on mental strategies. So as you would practice the physical side, you would also practice the skills on the mental side. So what sports psychology is not. So often I have athletes that come to me and it's sometimes when it's too late or already a problem has existed for a long period of time and they expect a fix straight away. But the thing with sports psychology is that it's not magic and it's also not a quick fix. So what often we and I tend to get across to athletes before I work with them is that, you know, these take time, these mental skills take time to develop. So whilst you might spend years and years practicing the physical side of the sport, you also need time to practice the mental side of the sport. So, and that's just what I said there. So in terms of, you know, practice makes perfect in the sports psychology world, we often say practice makes permanent or automatic, because what we're trying to do with anything that we want to learn or be an expert in, we want to make the behaviors automatic. So the more we practice things, the more we practice the mental strategies that we would incorporate, the more they become automatic and we don't have to actually think about doing them. And then that's when we'll get the most benefit from them. So another thing that often people kind of think is the stigma that's associated with seeing a sports psychologist. So coming to see a sports psychologist or seeking the help of a sports psychologist doesn't mean that you are broken or that you have a mental health concern. Now, whilst we do help athletes through mental well-being and mental health concerns, it doesn't mean that you have one if you're going to seek the help of a sports psychologist. What it ultimately means is that, you know, you're trying to better yourself by learning how to take control of your mind in high pressure situations. And that ultimately will help you in achieving consistent and optimal performance. So overall then, why do we use sports psychology, or why do we use the strategies of sports psychology? So when we exercise, we're placing an enormous stress on our body, and it's not just our physical body, it's also our mental, on our mind. So what we want to do then is we want to use mental strategies to help reduce as much as possible the mental stress that we're placing on our body when we exercise. And too much mental stress actually increases what we call our mental load. So what exactly then is mental load? And that's what will come next. So when we compete or we train or we do anything in sport, our brains are paying attention to a lot of different information all at once. So that could be the environment we're in, whether it's too hot, whether it's too cold. It could be the crowd. It could be our internal thoughts about how we compare to the next competitor. There's lots of different information going on. So all of these are what we call stresses. And when all of these stresses combine, they increase the amount of information or the loads that are placed on our brains to process. So in terms of that, our brain's capacity to process all of this information, however, is limited. And this often is where the negative situation arises. So in these situations, often the worst stressor will take over. So, for example, you'll often hear that people might choke, or they might, another word for that would be yip, or they might just kind of succumb to the pressure that they're under when they're competing. And in these situations, more often than not, what the problem is that they're paying too much attention to irrelevant information. So the crowd, or the temperature, or self-doubt, or the nerves, like I've just described. So unfortunately, in these situations, often the worst stressor is going to take over. So if you are experiencing a lot of self-doubt that day, often you're going to focus a lot more on the self-doubt than you would on the actual running of the race or the actual performance that you're trying to do. So as a sports psychologist, what I want to do is help decrease this mental load that's on you. So before I go into that, so increased mental load ultimately leads to decreased performance because we don't have enough mental space to process what matters in the moment. So my job then is to use strategies, or help give you strategies to help you cope with the stresses that are increasing your mental load. So let's go through then some of the actual factors that lead to this increased mental load. So first of all, we have these external expectations, and it's a good one to draw on now because of, you might have seen at the Olympics and before the Olympics with Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, with her mental health concerns because of the external expectations that were placed on her to address the media. Then with the Olympics, you have, for example, Simone Biles, the Olympic gymnast. She publicized that, a lot of stress that was on her were all these external expectations from the US Olympic organization, America, her coaches, and a lot of other different expectations. So this can have a huge impact on an athlete. And it doesn't even have to be at that level. It can also just be, here are just ourselves, like what does our coach expect from us, or what does our family think we're going to do, or how is the media going to portray us? So that often places a huge stress on an athlete, and something that we definitely need to work with the athlete to try and lessen in order to maintain performance somewhat. So then we have internal expectations. So these would be coming from ourselves. So a lot of this would often stem from, for example, setting unrealistic goals that we can't achieve, and then that ultimately leading to we're not good enough, or self-doubt, or that kind of thing. Then other types of internal expectations might come from, for example, comparison. So I might compare myself to another athlete that might be in the same race as myself. And that would ultimately, you're going to focus more on that in the moment. And if you don't have the strategies in place to overcome that and refocus and recenter yourself, then that can often take over and decrease your performance in the moment. Then we move on to personal life stresses that can that can add a toll to our mental load. So this might be in terms of finances, education, or your social life. Then relationships and support might also increase your mental load. So that in terms of, what's your relationship with your coach? Is there conflict there? What's your relationship with your family, your friends? Are they supportive of your career? All these different things that might play a role in increasing your mental stress. Then in terms of mental well-being, we might have things like I said before, like low self-esteem or low self-confidence that we might need to address and might be adding to your load. And another thing that's really important and is also quite topical at the moment because of the Olympics and, as it ends, who are you outside of your career as an athlete, or what do you do outside of that sport? Do you have an identity that's not related to just your sport? So as we come into the end of the Olympics, we often come across this term called the post-Olympic blues, which is related to people and also that it's not just people after the Olympics, it's also people retiring from the Olympics or retiring from their career post-Olympics. And it's all to do with, okay, now you're moving on. So what's next? So you're not going to be in your sport anymore. You're transitioning out. So a lot of the mental load that these athletes might be facing now in the coming months or so will be related to that side of things. Like, what are they going to do now, and who are they outside of their sporting career? Then another thing that might impact mental load would be mental health. So that often is related to burnout, anxiety, and worse, and other things like depression. And then lastly, injury. So that's not just having an injury, it's also the fear of injury and coping with that. And so altogether, these factors, they do have a massive increase on, or they place a massive increase on our mental load and our ability to perform at our best, especially in the moment and in high stress environments when we're thinking about all these things at the same time and we're not able to kind of put them to one side and just focus on the race or the thing that we're doing at that moment. So then we come on to how we actually reduce some of these stressors and reduce the mental load that we're experiencing. So there's a lot of different things that we can do together with your sports psych or that you can do yourself. So the first one of them, and it's quite simple, is goal setting. So I'm sure like some of you have used goal setting before. There's lots of different strategies online to help you goal set. Like you might have heard of SMART goals or open goals or different types of goals like that. But one of the stresses that athletes often face is not being able to achieve their goals. And that's often because they set goals that are not achievable, not realistic, or that there's a lot of obstacles in the way that they didn't control for in the beginning. And it's often then where we see a lot of issues in terms of, self-doubt, people losing confidence, motivation, and all that type of thing. So one of the best ways to reduce the load from the beginning is setting goals that are realistic, but also challenging. You want them to be challenging, but not too challenging. So it's getting the balance right there to try and encourage growth still, but also making sure or ensuring that you can actually achieve these goals. So that's the first step, and we'll talk about this a bit later on. Another way then to reduce mental load would be pre-performance routines. So you might have heard of these before. So often we will come up with different strategies in the 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or hour, or even day or week before a big race or a big performance. And it would come down to really planning out exactly what you're going to do in those days and hours leading up to your big performance. And having that structure often helps athletes to control their nerves or their anxieties that they would have before participation or in the event. So it's a good way to, have that structure beforehand so you know exactly what you're doing, and then you can reduce the load or the mental stress that you would be experiencing if you didn't have that routine in place. And we'll talk a bit about them later on. So then another thing then would be using different coping strategies during performance, and they could be in terms of, I don't know if you've heard of, for example, self-talk or mindfulness strategies or imagery or that kind of thing that we help athletes with to use as coping strategies during performance. And we'll talk about those later on as well. And then post-performance routines is another thing that often is ignored when it comes to teaching athletes different strategies, because we often think, okay, post-performance we'll just do a reflection and then we'll let everything will be okay, like athletes can continue with their lives. But actually what really needs to happen in that post-performance routine is you're setting the athlete up, or you're setting yourself up to reduce as much of that mental load as possible, so that you can go into the next training session or the next event with as the least amount of mental stress remaining that you're taking with you from the previous event or the previous day or whatever. And this is in terms of training day to day as well. So there's a whole host of different strategies you can do to mentally detach from the previous day's stress, the previous event stress, and we'll also talk about those later on. Then another way to reduce mental load then, as we talked about earlier on or in the last slide, is to develop healthy relationships. And that can be with, a big one would be that coach-athlete dynamic, and also the support from your family and friends and partners or whatever in your life. It's really important to develop those healthy relationships and have that support there to reduce some of that mental burden. Then developing a life balance. So this kind of comes back to identity that I spoke about a bit in the last slide. So what do you do to detach from your sport or detach from an event that just happened? Like what else is going on in your life? Are you into knitting, or are you in pursuing a degree, or are you who are you? What are your other hobbies? And it's important to have that in place so that your life doesn't suddenly revolve around or completely revolve around that sport, because if you do become, for example, injured all of a sudden, then what's in your life? And it's important to have that in place for an athlete and for yourself, so to actually relieve some of that mental stress that you would experience if you were to get injured, or if you were to transition into the next phase of your life. And that's the last point as well. So often we do career transition planning from the very beginning of working with an athlete, so that we can map out the career that's from 1 to 3 to 5 years time to 10 years time. And it's not, it's not specific. We know that life, it changes from week to week, or month to month, or day to day even. So, there'll be a lot of changing, a lot of adjusting and all that kind of thing from when we first do at the beginning of a relationship with a sports psychologist. But it's important to, have these kind of priorities in place, have these life balance plans in place, and all these kind of things. And it really does have a huge impact on the athlete, and on, controlling for the controllables, and how to deal with the uncontrollables as they appear. So there are some ways that we can reduce the mental stress, and ultimately the mental load that we place on, that these events and sports place on athletes. So now we'll move on to starting right. So in terms of starting right, what I wanted to kind of go through was like, okay, so if I was to work with an athlete, the first thing that I would want to do is to help them to, start right. So in terms of that, it would be goal setting and trying to figure out what they want, how they want to do it, when they want to do it by, and what are the obstacles in place that we can work through together to get that person to their athletic endeavors and whatever their goals might be. So what we're going to go through now then is goal setting, and how I would go through goal setting with an athlete, and what some of the best tips that I would have if you wanted to do it yourself or with your athlete. So just in terms of goal setting there quickly, so has anyone here used goal setting, a specific type of goal setting before? Like I already mentioned SMART goals. Is there has anyone used that technique or any other technique, or even used goal setting before? Okay. SMART goals, short-term, medium, and long-term goals. Nice. Okay. Okay, so first of all, what is goal setting then? And I'm sure everyone here knows what it is, but just to give you a quick definition, goal setting is really all about planning, specifically planning an outcome that you would want to achieve. And I'm just going to get my clicker. So why do we set goals then? And goal setting, it sounds really simple, and sometimes often it's kind of like not done right, and it's not done with specific purpose in terms of doing it whilst trying to make them realistic and achievable but challenging. So goal setting is important because it helps us to focus on a specific target. It helps increase our motivation to some extent, but it also helps us to be clear on what we want to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. So some tips that I've kind of accumulated over the years on how to set goals, and what I would advise people when they set goals, is that there are lots of different ways to set goals. There's that SMART goals, there's smarter goals, there's smartest goals, and there's no right way really to do it. We also now actually have an emergence in the literature on what's called open goals. So it's essentially just an open goal example would be, instead of saying I am going to run a sub 3 hour marathon, which would be a specific goal, an open goal will be I'm going to run as far as I can in 3 hours. And the literature is kind of leaning a little bit towards now that this type of open goal is a better way and a more achievable way and successful way to achieve a goal, to set a goal, rather than this smarter and kind of rigid way of doing it. But again, it's very much down to personal preference. It's very much down to what type of person you are, and if you need that specific direction, or you like more of it's a more of a challenge open goal, and that you can do as much as you can in a certain time or a certain distance or that kind of thing. So ultimately, the point is that there are lots of ways to set goals, and it really comes down to you. But my advice would be to keep it simple. decide the way that you want to do it and keep it consistent. And there's no need to go into, you know, all the the intricate details of smarter goals. Like a lot of them sometimes mean the same thing, and it's kind of hard to distinguish what, you know, measurable versus timely would be, and that kind of thing. So my advice would be to keep it simple. Then when you set goals, you want them to be realistic. So you want them to be realistic in terms of, you know, your time, the obstacles that might be in your way, but you also want them to be challenging, because if they're too easy to achieve, then you're not really setting up this growth environment for yourself. It's going to be very easy. You will lose motivation, and it's always better and to have this challenging environment for yourself and have this growth mindset, even though sometimes it might not be what you actually want, because it's obviously harder to do as to achieve challenging goals, but it's the way in which you would, you know, improve and get better. So lastly, what I would say about goals as well is that it's so important to review them often and even weekly, depending on, obviously, if they're long-term goals, you review them 6 months, yearly, or whatever. And if they're shorter, you are committing to weekly goals, that you do review them weekly and that you do adapt depending on your circumstances and whatnot. So I'm just going to briefly show you then how I would set goals and how I would do it with my athletes. So I have a 3-step process, and it starts off with the overall goal. So the overall goal is pretty straightforward. It would be, for example, a season goal. So let's say the season goal would be I want to run a sub 3-hour marathon, let's say. So that would be the overall goal. That stays the way it is. There'll be no changing of that throughout the season, unless obviously there's maybe there's some kind of unforeseen circumstance, like injury or something like that. But that would be the goal for the entire season. And obviously there can be a few of these, but let's just say this is the one for today. So I want to run a sub 3-hour marathon. So the next thing then would be, what can I do then in relation to this goal that will help, in relation to the performance of this goal, that will help me reach this overall goal. So step 2 would be to kind of think about this performance goal. So let's say, and this could be in relation to anything, it could be in relation to, I need to improve my mindset, I need to improve my nutrition, I need to improve my running style, etc. So let's say for this performance goal, I need to improve my hydration or something like that. So, and you'll have multiple performance goals that will ultimately lead to your overall goal. So let's say if I want to increase or improve my hydration. So now then step 3 would be, okay, well then, what can I do now or daily or weekly to achieve this performance goal, which will then lead ultimately to the overall goal at the end of the season. So this would be, for example, this is what's called a process goal. So this process goal then for me right now, if my performance goal is to improve my hydration, my process goal is to drink more water. So it could be I'm going to drink an extra liter of water a day. And this process goals, these are kind of like the daily goals. These are the ones that you want to review on a weekly basis or as often as possible. And then your performance goal is a more short-term goal. So it's more of a, a month, 2 month, 3 month kind of goal that you would review on a monthly, let's say, basis. And then once you achieve that performance goal, that's great. Then hopefully by then you'll have turned your process goal into a habit so that you are drinking more water regularly. And if not, you leave that goal where it is until it is a habit. And then you would alter your performance goals then to add or take away based on how you review your goals as the weeks and months go on. So that's kind of the process that I would use. I'm just going to show you another example to make it more clear. So the first thing then again is the overall goal. So it's a long-term goal, let's say the season goal. So let's say achieve a sub 3:30-hour marathon, keep repeating this overall goal. So then to achieve that overall goal, the first performance goal that I'm going to have is so in this performance goal, I want to determine the most optimal pre-run nutrition strategy for me, because I don't know what it is and I'm just eating whatever I want. And so then that performance goal, to achieve that performance goal, I need to set a process goal that's going to be related to that. So for example, my process goal for this week might be to trial porridge as my meal before the long runs this week. So again, the process goal is a weekly review. So you want to be reviewing that as often as possible. So weekly is time enough. And then as the weeks go by, you'll discover whether porridge or whether whatever food is right for you before you run. And then you'll have achieved your performance goal, and you can essentially move on to the next performance goal. Now, you can have multiple performance goals going at the same time. You don't need to just have one. You can have one for each pillar, for example, nutrition, strength and conditioning, and running specific, etc. It's completely up to you, but that's just a really simple example of the way that I would approach goal setting. So naturally, one of the biggest issues with goals is that they often fail. And this is more often than not due to reasons that could have been avoided. And it's down to not acknowledging the barriers that you would have faced in achieving the goals as you set them. So alongside when you're making the goals at the beginning of the season, or even as you change your goals throughout a season, it's important that each time you set a new goal that you do acknowledge the barriers that you might have to face whilst achieving this goal. So for example, what I would do is step one for each goal, I would assess these obstacles. So, and then I'd write a list quadrant here. So on the top there, you'll see important and not important columns. On the left there, you'll see in my control and out of my control. So it's about then placing those obstacles, like I have no runners, into the specific box. So first of all, is having no runners in my control? Well, let's say yes, it is. And is it important? Of course it's important, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to run. So it will be in this box here. And this is the obstacles that go into this box are the most important obstacles that you need to address in the short term before you can start achieving your goals. If they're in your control, but they're not important, then you might need to address them. They might come up in the future, but they're definitely something that you don't need to address. They're not a priority to address. If they're out of your control, but they're important, then that's when you need to think about some strategies that you can use to mitigate the stress that would cause you if it's out of your control. So for example, let's say it's raining every day outside and it's freezing cold, or let's say it's cold, it's raining, and then there's ice the next morning for the first couple of months of your training block. So this is out of your control. Think about how you're going to adapt to it. If it's really cold and raining is the issue, what strategies can you use to cope with that environment, that cold environment, and that kind of thing. So, and lastly, if it's out of your control and it's not important, then it's really not important, and you shouldn't think about it, and it shouldn't have an impact on you achieving your goals. So the last point then there was just what I said there. So it's about reflecting on what you can control, what is important, and prioritizing those in terms of how you're going to deal with them. What mental strategies might you be able to use to counteract the mental stress that might come, or the physical stress that might come from not overcoming those obstacles. Okay, so that's goal setting. So I just wanted to touch on this as well briefly. So having no motivation or a lack of motivation is such a common reoccurring theme that comes up with athletes that I see and work with. So I just wanted to touch on it really briefly. So motivation, as we know, no one is motivated 100% of the time. Motivation comes and goes, and it depends on it's a day-to-day thing really. So it's important that sometimes when you do lose motivation, that the first thing that you consider or you go back to is why are you doing what you're doing in the first place, and what do you want to achieve? Why is it important to you, and that kind of thing. So why are you doing this? But sometimes even the best or the most resilient athletes, that might not work. So on those days, what's important is that you can develop habits that are so strong that you can persevere when your motivation is so low. So and that will help you maintain that consistent practice or consistent routine and help you achieve ultimately your goals on time and when you need them to come through. Now, there is a caveat there though as well, because sometimes when you do have a long extended period of no motivation, it might be time to, you know, take a break, listen to your body, listen to your mind, and that's very important. And it might be the case that you may need rest, and that mental and physical detachment from your sport might be what you need to regain the motivation and to reassess what's going on in your life. So one quick tip to help you with the days that you're not feeling motivated, especially when you are trying to implement a new habit or a new routine or a new goal, is called habit stacking. Now, some of you might have heard of it. It has been made popular by James Clear from his book. But what it involves essentially is it's a strategy. It's a very, very simple but really effective strategy to help you when you're trying to implement a new routine and to maintain consistency in the first couple of weeks while you're trying to do that, because those first couple of weeks are often the time when we lose motivation and we're not consistent in trying to maintain the new habit that we're trying to put into our program or training routine. So how we do it is that essentially you stack your habits. So you put one on top of the other, or put the new habit in between the routine habits. So what you want to do is you want to put the new habit in between or before or after habits that you already do. And then as you do those over time, the new behavior will become automatic. So just to show you what I mean by that, or give you an example. So let's say your goal is to drink more water daily. So you want to put that in as a new habit into routines or into habits that you already do. So for example, if you get up at 7 a.m. and that's your routine, you always get up at 7 a.m. Perfect. Then straight after you wake up, you go to the kitchen, you make a coffee. So those two things are routine habits. You do them every day or nearly every day. So to try and implement your new habit, so drink another glass of water a day, while you're waiting for the kettle to boil, so during your routine habit, instead of just standing there or doing whatever, drink 1 glass of water during that time. So it sounds so simple, but it's one of the most effective ways to implement a new strategy or a new habit into your routine. And that's an example there. And that's all I have to say about that, really. But you can also add it before or in between or whatever. And there's lots of different ways that you can do habit stacking for, or lots of different things you can use habit stacking for, pretty much anything. But as I said, it's a really good way to kind of get that in there and try and maintain consistency as you're already doing the other things already. So it's not as hard as starting something new on its own, and it's not as daunting and that kind of thing. So, okay, so let's move on then to the next part, which is pre-performance routines. So just really briefly, I'll just ask another question. So has anyone here, or does anyone use pre-performance routines, or have heard of them? And a few yes, okay. Okay, that's good. So let's go into it then. So what are pre-performance routines? So pre-performance routines, they are a sequence of task relevant thoughts, so thoughts related to what you're about to do, and actions which a person engages in prior to their performance. And often people use these pre-performance routines as a way to take control of the situation, the environment, your emotions, help with focus, and decrease or increase activation. Now, what do I mean by activation there? So before competition, you might be quite nervous, which would indicate a high level of activation, or you might be quite calm, which would indicate a low level of activation. So first of all, I want to just throw in there that nerves are good, but too many nerves is and not being able to cope with the impact of that high level of emotion is when problems arise. So in order for you to achieve consistent and optimal performance, you have to find out what your optimal zone of activation is prior to performance. So do your best performances come after you've been highly activated? So in terms, another word for activation that we would use as well is arousal. So it's in relation to how alert you are or how physically ready you are. It's kind of like your readiness zone, if you're not getting the activation terminology there. But the most important thing for us as sports psychologists is just to try and find out what your optimal level or what your optimal zone is before competition, so that we can help you use strategies to either hype you up or raise your activation or calm you down if the nerves are getting too much. So, and this is one of the biggest areas of sports psychology in terms of competition. So here is what's called, in the literature, in research, it's called the inverted U hypothesis. It's also called the activation upside down U. It's called the arousal zones. It's called a lot of different things, but for now we'll just call it the optimal zone of activation. So this is where we're trying to find what level of activation or arousal or alertness you need to be in to perform at your best prior to going into competition or racing the event or whatever. So on the bottom there you can see the activation level. So it goes from low to very high. And then on the left side there you have your performance, and it goes from very poor performance up to your optimal performance. So on the left side of the upside down U, you have your low level of activation, which is correlated there with low performance. So in this zone, we often find that people will be quite low activated. So this means having a low heart rate, maybe potentially being sleepy, being bored, and we're finding people being unmotivated and not in flow, not focused, that kind of state. Now, just as a caveat as well before I continue, is that these are the zones that I'm about to say next. Whilst they are the ideal zone for the general population, this is very individualized. You have to find out, like some people, like I just said, in this state here, this low activation state might actually perform optimally. And it really depends on the person and what you prefer and how you utilize the occasion before you perform. So whilst this might be generally the zone for low performance and low activation, this might not be the case for everyone. But most people do perform optimally in this zone of moderate to high activation. It's the zone where people find their flow, where they're motivated, where they're focused. In this zone, on a physiological level, you have, your heart rate is at a high but not too high level. You're ready for competition, you're ready to react, you have activated what's called your sympathetic nervous system, so you're ready to fight, you're ready to run, and that kind of thing. So often you'll see a lot of people, or a lot of athletes, do perform at their best when they're in this zone. And then the last zone there is the very high zone. So this is a zone where you find a lot of, it's called a zone of delusion. So often people here, they lose their focus, they're high in emotion, they're disengaged, and this is where the mistakes happen. And when you're in this zone for too long of a period, that's very indicative of burnout. So it's important to watch that as well with your athletes. So like I said, what we're trying to do, and what I'm trying to say here, is that in order to get your athlete, or for you to perform at your best, you have to find out what your optimal zone is of activation before you go and you race your event, or you take part in whatever event you're participating in. And to do this, for me, it's often about reflecting on past competitions and times when you performed your best, and reflecting on the day or the hours leading up to the competition and what you did. And it's often then about monitoring then for a couple of weeks or months over the course of a season, maybe, to find out what zone and what strategies work best for an individual player. And once you find that out, it often leads to consistency in terms of performance, and it also helps athletes find their flow state, which is a term you might have heard of before, but I won't go into today. So this is just an example. So I currently working with a male, and he's a shot putter. And this is an example of his activation zone. So we found out over the course of a season that he performs best when he is in this slightly above moderate activation zone prior to a throw. So you can see there that the inverted U is kind of rightly skewed a bit. So that's the zone that he performs best in. So therefore, we work together on developing strategies that helps him to get into that activated zone. So strategies for activation, briefly I'll go into a couple of them. So activated breathing is the first one. So often you might hear that breathing is just for calming down, but also it can be used as for hyping people up and getting people into that alert and ready state physiologically. So it's just a case of doing faster paced breathing. So you'll see here 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. So 2, 2 means 2 breaths in, 2 breaths out. 3 breaths in, 3 breaths out, 4 breaths in, 4 breaths out. Anything longer than that would be, you're kind of more on the calming down side of things. Then we have activating imagery. So imagery is all about visualizing exactly what you're going to do and how everything's going to play out in your performance. Then we have self-talk. So this is can be positive or motivational, and you often hear people, you know, hyping themselves up out loud or internally, and this is a really good way to hype yourself up, talk yourself up, and increase your activation. Music is a big one. Cold water is another one. So splashing your face with cold water, your wrists, your neck, or even drinking. So this actually, cold water actually increases or activates your sympathetic nervous system, which is a system that activates your whole body response to being ready to perform. Then just exercise on its own is good. So you'll often see even recently at the Olympics, a lot of before the 100-meter final, you saw there was one athlete who was doing some tuck jumps right before they were about to take off. So this is just to, you know, hype up again and get that activated state up. Then you have physical triggers like slapping the thigh, slapping the face or the shoulders. And then the last one is power posing. This one, you'll often see athletes stand really broad chested, hands on the hips, legs spread apart and ready, and like showing that kind of power position, because it's not only it's not only for their opponents to see, but also, and it's a subconscious thing as well, of course, unless you're planning to do it, but it also actually increases your activation in a lot of different ways, both physiologically and psychologically. So then quickly, some strategies for lowering the activation if you wanted to get into a lower state. So then you have the deep breathing. So you have the slower paced breathing, 5-5, 4.5, 5.5. So having that exhale a little bit longer than the inhale. Then you have calming self-talk, music again, meditation, progressive muscle relaxation. So that one is actually related to the picture that's there. So you just go through each part of your body and breathe into it is how it goes. And then the last one there would be some different mindfulness practices. So this is just a quick tip. So what I would do to help players kind of map out their pre-performance routine. You can go, like I said, a week before, an hour or a day before, a couple of days before, or a couple of hours before. I often focus mostly on the hour before, then the 30 minutes before, and then the 15 minutes before. And the 15 minutes before there is in pink because that's the time that I would often get or advise athletes to do their activation or deactivation strategies, because it's closest to the performance without being in that 5-minute period where, you know, you are really getting ready and getting set to go. So it's good to have planned out for the athletes and for yourself, because, you know, whatever way you can limit your mental stress or stress during this is good. So if you have this plan in place already and it's, you know, it off by heart and it's ready to go, then hopefully it will assist you in you know, getting into that state that you need to be in. So then we'll just move on to strategies for during performance. So these are pretty similar strategies that we would use, you know, as I described some of them there as pre-performance strategies like imagery. We wouldn't really use imagery during performance, but self-talk, mindfulness strategies and that kind of thing. So it's all about using the same strategies in different ways in order to adapt in these high pressure situations during performance and keep you focused. Okay, so in athletics events in particular, and in a lot of different events really, but in athletics events in particular, what we want to really do to help a person, especially in endurance events, we want to try and lower a person's rate of perceived exertion. So what this is a person's perception or how they think or how hard they think that they are working in that moment. So you might have heard of RPE before, so it's called rate of perceived exertion, and there's lots of different scales to measure it. Sometimes it goes from 0 to 10, sometimes it goes from 6 to 20, but let's just say it goes from 0 to 10. So it goes from 0, not working at all, to 10, the maximal effort ever done. by you in like running or whatever the event is. So in terms of my role in this is I want to try and limit the external factors that might be playing a role in how hard a person thinks they're performing in a race. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail now in a minute. But so many external factors can make you think that you're working harder than you actually are. And some of these factors might cause you to drop out earlier or slow down, etc. And this can be down to nerves, term performance, temperature as well, crowd, and etc. There's a lot of different other factors. So we'll just move on here. So on the left here, you'll actually see the RPE scale. So what I'm talking about. So this scale goes from 0 to 10. So 0, you're not doing anything, you're at rest, and 10 being, maximal, just like my hardest race, or an experience that you haven't experienced before. So as I said, like during an endurance event or during any athletics event, you often, you're thinking about how hard you're actually working. And that mental feedback that you're giving your body, or that your body is giving you, is determining how hard you think you're doing. And often people can drop out with that information because if they feel pain, or it's getting too hard for them, or there's too many factors that they have to deal with at the same time, like how to deal with the temperature as well, or the crowd, or comparing to the person who's just passed you out, like all these things can impact your perception of how hard you're going, and this can lead you to drop out. So that's why it's vital for me to help you and for you to reduce the impact of external factors that might increase this perception of effort that you think how hard you're going, so that you can perform optimally and for hopefully the entire race. So for example, just a couple of examples. So for a hot day, you want to have cooling strategies in place. In high altitude, if you're doing training camps or that, music has been shown to help with reducing your perception of effort. If you're experiencing self-doubt, that would be where confidence strategies would come in. If there's crowd noise or you're succumbing to the occasion, that's where I would want to bring in some refocusing strategies, so that you're just focusing on you in the moment and how you really feel, and not impacted by all these external things. And then of course nerves, and like we've already discussed, that would be using the pre-performance routines. So lastly then, we'll just move on to some strategies for post-performance or mental recovery. So mental recovery, just like physical recovery, is very important, and it helps us mentally detach from the event and what just happened in that event or training or whatever, to prepare us for the next day. So by planning mental recovery, you're lessening the mental load that you go into the next training session or the next competition with. And strategies for that might include journaling after the event or the next day. Sometimes if you had a poor performance, people don't want to meditate on it or that kind of thing straight after. So journaling the day after or whenever you feel like it is a good way to do it. Meditating on what just happened also. A good one then is focused reflection and goal setting. So that one might be, maybe not straight after, but maybe the next day even. So you'd reflect on what went well, what didn't go so well, and then goal setting and adapting your goals based on what you learned or what you think needs to be better. Music is a good way to mentally detach from from the event or what just happened, and doing absolutely unrelated tasks which you enjoy is also a great way to mentally detach and prepare for the next session and the next event. Okay, so we're nearly finished. So just one last slide I just wanted to touch on briefly as well, and it's mainly because of Tokyo and what's going on over there in terms of the environment and how hot it is. And also I love this topic because it's my PhD and what I specialize in. But just to briefly talk about it, so we do have the Olympics in Tokyo. It is roasting hot. It is a huge stressor that's placed on both the body, but what's often forgotten is the impact that this heat is going to have also on the mind and the mental load that I talked about earlier on. So as you've probably already seen, the marathon was moved up north to cooler conditions. Triathlon was started very early. It's not such a big impact on sprinting, but still of course it is somewhat. But all these events, even the tennis, you probably saw that as well, that was changed around a bit to cope with the athletes that were experiencing some major heat stress and which could ultimately lead to heat stroke. And unfortunately, thankfully, there has been no serious injury or death from it yet, and hopefully there won't be. But and you will have seen as well that there are a lot of cooling strategies in place. Like you'll have seen some athletes running around with ice cooling jackets on. They're handing out ice packs during the triathlon. They have cooling baths and ice baths for after sprint events, after the rowing and all that kind of thing. And you might also have heard as well, some Irish athletes that have given post-race interviews, or even Leona Maguire, the golfer, has gone over, has discussed as well, and the rugby sevens have discussed about using hot baths to acclimatise as best they can before Tokyo. So my point here essentially is that environmental stress, such as heat and altitude and cold, can also place a huge extra load on your mental performance, because you're used to training in these cold and wet conditions, but when you have this extra heat stress, you have an increased kind of sensation of the heat, you've increased perception of the temperature and the core temperature, and your heart rate's increase, and you have all these symptoms that you're not used to dealing with, and this can place a huge mental burden and a mental load on you. And it's important then to have mental strategies in place as well to decrease that extra load. So it's important, as I said, to have these extra strategies. And for the heats, for example, acclimatization will be key. And then strategies such as cold drinks, cooling baths, ice packs, and then adjusted mental strategies to cope with the extra stress are what is important. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your time. I know it's only 2 minutes left, sorry, but I hope that was somewhat helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. That was great. I took it off myself anyway. But no, the PhD, the whole PhD study in general there about the environmental climates and whatnot, something I don't know how they're doing it over there at the moment, just because I actually watched the tennis match in particular you're on about as well, and you could nearly see the steam coming off the players. It just looked that warm.
Yeah, definitely. It's I couldn't believe it when they were saying that even the water temperature for the triathletes was like a hot bath. It's insane. I don't know how they're coping over there, but they do have really good cooling strategies and that in place over there that I've seen. So it's good. And they moved the marathon, which was one of the main things that people were concerned about. So that's great.
Yeah, and you'd imagine all that stuff was on very early in the morning anyway, because I know the 50k race walk is on at 9:30 our time tomorrow night, so I assume that's 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning over there.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I'd say you're off the hook. You could be off the hook here with questions and whatnot by the looks of things. Well, Kate, are you okay to send out a copy of the slides, or are they?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's the same question from 3 or 4 people, so you're all good.
Cool.
So,
Okay. Thank you very much.
Very welcome. Thank you.
you're very welcome, guys. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Kate, just one quick one there. Do you have any involvement with the new Leaving RPE course, or do you go into schools or anything?
No, I don't have, no.
No. Cool. You're very welcome, Teresa. Take care.
Okay, just a question from myself. Like, say if you're working with an athlete, like, would you recommend, like, is it through certain sessions, or like say a month, or is it kind of when the athlete needs it, or what kind of way do you work that?
Yeah, so that's definitely a tricky one. Me personally, I would want to have kind of a 3 month continuous, like maybe every second week or even every week ideally, but every second week more so is probably more realistic for most people. But that's more so in terms of developing a relationship, because
Yeah.
often you can't do half the stuff I was already saying without having a relationship with the athlete to be able to push them and challenge them and find out, you know, even what I was saying with the activation stuff, you can find that out in a couple of sessions. So I would always encourage or only take on people who will commit to that first couple of months, and then after that, you know, it's very much up to them if they find it beneficial, if they want to continue and that kind of thing. But obviously the longer you stay at it and the longer, the more consistent you are and the more you learn, of course, the better.
Cool, thank you.
Welcome.
Kate, one from my side as well, a bit more general though.
Yeah.
Do you have different, is it a total different type of sports psychology to work with someone who's, let's say, involved in a team sport compared to someone who was involved with an individual sport? Is it a completely different technique you use altogether, or are the principles still the same?
Oh, it's the exact same, yeah. The only, obviously the extra things you probably work on there is, you know, how to work as a team dynamics, teamwork, how to communicate and all that kind of thing. But like I work across so many different sports, including esports as well. And all the techniques are the same, even within the different disciplines. And it's just, there might be an extra few things like that team stuff that I said there. And that would be it, really.
Perfect. And one from our audience. Kate, what strategies do you recommend to deal with nerves and anxiety in the days leading up to an event if the anticipation becomes almost debilitating but not as bad in the hour or so just before the event?
Okay, so that's in the days leading up. So in terms of those, it would be really trying to figure out, first of all, where the nerves are coming from and what's the reason why they're becoming that debilitating in the days up. Because normally, whilst that's really normal that you would feel that as well, because often we would do week-long pre-performance routines, and that would be probably what I would advise, like to do, instead of just focusing on that hour before, focusing on the week before. And there's a lot of different things you can do to help there. So in terms of if you want to calm down the nerves and get rid of them per se, but also I'm not trying to say get rid of them either, because nerves are good and it's about harnessing the energy and the activation that the nerves bring you as well. So it's just about turning them around into good, and how you can use them to help you perform well on the day as well. So different strategies anyway are, for example, imagery can help there. Using mindfulness strategies to really focus back on the moment and not too far ahead, if it's the tournament or the event that's coming up that you're nervous about. Just really controlling your routine as well, getting that routine nailed down and understanding the reasons why you are nervous in the first place, and trying to do your best and to use strategies to help control those reasons and to understand those reasons that are causing those nerves. So that'd be what I would say in general, without knowing what the cause of the nerves are. But you know, preparation and planning is the best way.
Perfect. Thanks, Kate.